My name is Petre Earle. I'm an economist and a research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research. If you like the things I say or you want to hear more, you want to talk about liberty, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, Amazon. I have an Amazon author page and all that sort of thing. But for now, let's talk about, this is the book that came out. It's called Coronavirus and Economic Virus. And the introduction of the book was only written on March 20th, and the afterword on March 27th, and the book was published the 29th. So we had a very, very fast turnaround. It's got about 260 pages. There are 22 authors, but it was mostly written by myself and Jeff Tucker. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Jeff Tucker. I wrote the foreword, the afterword, 5 or 6 of the articles, and then I chose all the other articles to be in the book and edited them for content. So getting started, we call this a first draft of history because it came out as things were developing. And readers in the future, we hope, can trace how things developed over a course of 68 days between when the first infection arrived in the United States and when the book was essentially published. It's divided into 5 sections. Those 5 sections are before the crisis unfolds, the crisis hits, crisis and chaos, and living with crisis. So I figured what I would do is I would go through each of the 5 sections of the book. I'd talk about some of the noteworthy points. I won't talk about the whole thing because there's a lot to read. I'll relate some passages, make some comments, and then when we're done, we'll open it up for questions. Okay. So the first part, which is called Before the Crisis, it looks at the preparations that were made early on and some of the early policy discussions. So pandemics have become less frequent over time, and they're generally less severe when they occur. So on January 28th, one of our economists, Vincent Geloso, said the following, and this is just as it was coming out. This is the day after the first infection appeared in the United States. He basically wrote, no matter how this develops, soft-handed measures are cheaper and more effective in diminishing contagion than heavy-handed measures. This is something worth bearing in mind as news keeps unfolding about the outbreak of the coronavirus. So already, we had an idea that if this was developing and if this was going to happen in the US and in other places, anywhere the way it did in China, the government might find it advantageous to take very heavy-handed measures in the way that they sometimes do when there's a crisis. People have been saying in the US, they've been saying pandemic is the, what's the old saying? It says, I don't know if I can remember it right now. I'll remember it by the time we're done, though. But basically, it was war is the Randolph Bourne comment was war is the health of the state, and people began saying that a contagion or pandemic is the health of the state. But the fact is, crisis is the health of the state. Crisis, regardless of what type. Okay. One of the things that we've learned, by the way, in this crisis is that there's a lot spoken about the United States Constitution. And at this point, after everything that's happened since maybe World War II, in particular, the war on terror and that sort of thing, and now with the coronavirus, we've learned that the U.S. Constitution is either ineffective in slowing down government encroachment or it's actually helping them. Because the one thing it's not doing is slowing down the encroachment of the state on the individual. So when we talk about the crisis unfolding, that deals with the early impact of U.S. financial markets. And that's a part that I sort of specialize in. I spent 21 years as a trader of equities, options, futures, bonds, and all that sort of thing. So I wrote most of these articles. And one issue that came up pretty regularly is why many stocks fell so hard and so far so quickly. We saw the second worst day the second worst day drop in a century. The market on the date, I'll remember in a second, I believe it was March 16th, the U.S. equity markets fell about 13%. And it was actually by definition the first crash since 1987. I spent 21 years, like I said, on Wall Street. I didn't see a crash, but I did from the vantage point of AIER. We also had the worst month in March in over 100 years. So there was a lot of severity. But people kept on asking, they kept on saying, why is it that stocks are falling so hard? Why is it that, after 9/11, the markets fell about 8%, but in one day, they fell 12% because of the coronavirus, and in a month they fell like 34%. And so it's at this point that we began hearing about things like and if you laugh, you should, about hearing about like apocalypse and extinction events and zombies and all that sort of thing. Is this the new Living Dead? Is this the real Walking Dead and all that stuff? And so in response to that, I wrote a section here that's right here. And I said, basically, oops, I'm sorry, it's here. I said, the sell-off in stocks has nothing to do with concerns like extinction level events or other cataclysms, but those are entertaining to consider. So if it keeps your mind off getting sick, then that's great. But stocks are fundamentally units of title to aggregates of capital goods, and financial markets are the social machinery which serve to discount future earnings. So in the most immediate hysteric-free sense, equities are just repriced based on an expectation of lower earnings in the future. And the fact is, after things like 9/11 or after, say, the first Gulf War or whatever you can think of, there is precedence for saying, okay, earnings tend to go down this much, stocks tend to rebound in this amount of time, but this is something that hasn't happened in a very, very long time. Markets tend to like certainty, hate uncertainty, but what they hate more than what they hate more than negative news is uncertainty. So that was a big problem, and that's why stocks fell so far so quickly. This is also at the point where Trump began saying he hadn't ruled out any of the same policies that we had seen enacted previously in China. And so, we said very clearly in this section, here's a better idea. Cut taxes, cut tariffs, and any other barriers to commerce immediately and dramatically. This is not a good time for artificial barriers. Tear them down immediately, not an artificial stimulus. It's what we should do anyway. It's just more the prospect of disease-inspired recession should focus the mind on good policy. We should also let prices be allowed to rise without being decried as gouging. So our thesis from the very beginning of this at AIER is that states are pretty much always the last to know what's happening, and there are no incentives that they face that keep them from adopting interim or cautious policies. They almost always choose because they're rewarded for using a hammer for every problem, even with incomplete information. And for that reason, we were cautioning from the very start. We also would discuss the Federal Reserve throwing the printing press behind the crisis, which is almost certain to fail for a few reasons. One of the reasons is that monetary policy is good for offsetting negative aggregate demand shocks. For example, when expenditures fall due to an increase in demand or an increase in demand to hold money, or money becomes scarce. Those are basically deflationary type conditions. Coronavirus is causing a fall in the aggregate supply, which means that output is below the level it would be with a certain capital structure, which in turn means that the kind of crisis we're facing is one where prices are likely to rise. And either the Fed, so we're still working on this, but the Fed, either the Federal Reserve misdiagnosed the problem. There's three possibilities, right? Either they misdiagnosed the problem, they were anticipating a credit crisis, which is not happening, or there's a third option, which we're starting to consider more, and I've written a little bit about this. We're going to cover it more soon as we see how this unfolds. We think that with the U.S. generating now tremendous budget deficits, almost $1 trillion a year, the Fed is adopting sort of a strange middle-of-the-road policy where they're providing liquidity and trying to make it easier for the U.S. to continue borrowing. So it's a really unusual policy that they've chosen, but we'll see how it works out eventually. What we don't see now, and what I've been telling a lot of people, is that this is not like the continuation of 2008, 2009. This is a different animal, this particular crisis. And while we've seen liquidity issues, and I can speak about those if you like, we haven't seen any real credit issues. So that's an improvement. That's a good thing. Okay. The third part of the book, Crisis Hits, that's early March. And we look at a few things. One is a new narrative, and the other is the South Korean approach, which people began to hear about at this time. The South Korean approach at that time was different than anywhere else except for maybe Singapore, and now we're finding out that Sweden has done some similar things. But the new narrative section discusses the opportunism shown by a lot of the media early on. So at AIER, given our policy and our economic bend, and me personally, we're not typically in the habit of defending Trump, but there is something to be said for honest and ethical reporting and the need for that sort of thing in society at large. And so our concern is that in 5 or 10 years, there'll be two very different historical accounts of both these events and policies during the coronavirus outbreak and during the COVID-19 infections. And the truth will either be somewhere between those two accounts or just gone, completely forgotten. So there's two possibilities with respect to that. But I deal with that in an article I wrote. And then as for the South Korean portion of the South Korean portion of this chapter, it's interesting to note that this was until last week or so. This is actually AIER's most read, most successful article in history. For whatever reason, I think people found it interesting and it got shared around a lot. But basically, South Korea's coronavirus policies were basically, we could describe them like this, and I'll again read from here. South Korea leveraged private property rights to thwart the spread of the virus, with building owners posting and enforcing no mask, no entry signs. Drive-through testing stations were set up nationwide through which individuals, after a 10-minute test, were notified within a few hours if infected. A voluntary self-diagnosis app was created in the early stages of the pandemic, and living and treatment centers were set up in a soft quarantine spirit. Now, it's important to qualify this a little bit. First of all, Korea had a lot of experience with both the SARS and with H1N1, so they were more prepared for this anyway. I also heard a theory, I'm not sure, I believe I have to chase it down a little more, that the prospect of chemical or biological war with North Korea has also made them more prepared for these types of things. So, and another thing is that we would be remiss, we'd be erroneous if we held out South Korea as, necessarily a bastion of liberty or whatever, because the trade-off for not going into these quarantines is that they did track a lot of people electronically, which is a privacy violation of its own. But even so, I think they've been able to keep their economy running and all that sort of thing. So it's been an improvement. And another personal note is just this morning, I walked by a store near where I live, and somebody had a sign outside that said, "No mask, no entry." That's the first time I've seen this, although it's been going on apparently in Korea and other places for, well over, maybe up to 2 months. And last I read, the infection rates in Korea had been falling. At that time, they were. That was about a week and a half after they began this implementation of mobile testing sites, and soft quarantine, and all that. So, the fourth section is called Crisis and Chaos, and this is where we really get into the depth of the crisis, and in particular, the U.S. government's attempt to commit economic suicide. So this is mid-March, maybe only really about 2.5 weeks ago. We saw quarantine orders, which were basically, they started at the federal level, but it was states and counties, smaller local governments that really laid into this heavily, and some of them have been absolutely tyrannical. There have been cops busting up social gatherings. People have been fined and arrested. In New York City, they've said you can get a $1,000 fine if you're caught outside and you're not supposed to be, or if you're not observing social distancing, so all that sort of thing. Bars and restaurants are shut. A lot of massive events and festivals canceled. Domestic and international flights at about 10% of their normal levels just a few weeks ago. And for the first time, that's one of the things that's been interesting as an economist in this recession, is that I'm having to open up history books because I didn't remember the actual numerical definition of a stock market crash. And now people are actually asking me, I was asked in an interview last week, could this be a depression and not a recession? And it actually turns out that there are a few definitions of depression, one of which I think is quite likely. The other I think is quite unlikely. So that's something, if you want to, I can describe afterwards as well. And in this section, one of the lines that we have is, this is something that Jeffrey Tucker and I wrote. I don't know what should or shouldn't be shut down, but neither does the government have any magical or special access to information on risk probabilities and the proper way forward. In fact, government is the last institution that should be making this judgment. Government acts out of self-interest. Enterprise acts in public interest. The obvious answer here is to leave the decision to private actors who are in the best position to make a good judgment on what should shut and what should open. So that was our take on that. And then this is also when we began to see the beginning of pundits blaming capitalism for empty shelves. And we responded basically that if policies restrict the free movement of prices, empty shelves and prolonged scarcity are what you should expect. So this led to an interesting conversation as well, because we have some of our big box stores here in the U.S. like Kmart and Target and Walmart and all those. I guess Kmart's long gone, actually. Walmart anyway, then and and Target. But so I can understand that for these big retailers with their low prices and with their supplier arrangements and all that, that it's hard for them to change their prices, right? They're not just going to, when they start to run low on hand sanitizer or certain types of disinfectant or toilet paper, they can't let prices rise. But this is what I find it difficult to sort of stomach is places like eBay and places like Amazon Marketplace and some of those other places where people can list their own things. They've been taking down prices they deem too high. And I would love to see a system where, even if Walmart and Target and all those can't change prices, say, overnight, they will watch the price trends on, say, eBay and those types of marketplace where there's a lot more flexibility. And that could send that sort of signal, just like Hayek and everybody else talks about, through the economy, that here there's a lack of supply, there's scarcity, and there's also great profit margins for those who will supply. So I like to think that those kinds of places could be an early warning system for the rest of the economy. But there's a public policy aspect there, a public policy facet to letting people raise prices as high as they want. And in some places in the U.S., it's actually illegal. As we mentioned before, it's called gouging. And this is also when this is actually the date, the 16th of March, when the stock market crashed. It was down 13% on top of another, say, 20 or 25% in the weeks before that. First crash since 1987. That's 33 years ago. The worst month since 1931. And although that was, I think, baked in, that was going to happen with all the uncertainty, I did have to make one point in this article, and that was that I don't know what happened between maybe the 80s or 90s and now, but whenever there was an announcement, whenever there was a briefing, the president would always do it, or other people, Congress, whatever, they would do it. It's like 7 p.m. when the markets were closed. Trump began doing a press conference at maybe 1 or 2 in the afternoon, and you could see the minute he started talking, the market just went straight down. So I mean, that's just, to me, that's either a sign of incompetence or just somebody told him that he needs to speak now, and he didn't. So that's just really, really clumsy to do. And I had a note here about that as well. And that note was, the real history of this stock market crash is that the market began to fall exactly as the political class began to panic, speak of shutdowns, demand flight cancellations, talk of closing up, and essentially stopping history. The calamity before our eyes is beginning to look like some version of an imagined dystopia, while the rest of us are left to struggle the old-fashioned way. There is indeed a virus among us, one far more damaging than that which goes by the name COVID-19. And that's where we began to see the proverbial tail walk the dog in terms of U.S. policy and how the crisis was being faced. And the fifth and final part of the book is called Living in Crisis. And we sort of deal with an uncertain future. At this point, every classical liberal in history had been vindicated. Menger and Fetter on the subjective theory of value, Hayek on the use of information in society and the inability of central planning to gather or use information. Morgenstern, who my dissertation work is actually on, about the inaccuracy in social science data and quantification. Ludwig von Mises on how intervention tends to create the need for further intervention. And also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Rothbard, who at all junctures reminds us that the state is often a gang of thieves writ large. Also, AIER's founder, Edward C. Harwood, who taught us to fight for liberty, but always with integrity and to be bold. And this book is essentially what that was about, being part of that fight. In this final section, probably the most important section of the book, in my opinion, I'd love to say my own, but actually not, is an article by Dr. Earle called "Leaving People Alone is the Best Way to Fight Coronavirus." And our thesis is that this disease is a social and medical or scientific one, and that throughout history, human beings have individually and as part of voluntary social groups discovered and applied actions which meet their local and personal needs. So as the doctor summarizes in this, I believe it's the final article, the classical liberal conception of the purpose and function of government is to protect individual lives, liberty, and honestly acquired property of its citizens. This includes an impartial and equal rule of law. Anything that goes beyond these duties and responsibilities must by necessity involve an encroachment on political power over the actions and decision-making of free individuals. So government is a one-size-fits-all proposition, and we believe individuals should be allowed to sort of weigh their own benefits and trade-offs. If we do that, some people will stay inside. A lot of people will take the types of, will pursue the sorts of options that I saw today, we saw in Korea, where people say no entry without mask to their stores or whatever. And some people will just walk around and do whatever. But at any rate, this one-size-fits-all proposition is going to be extremely damaging for the economy. And who knows? I mean, it might almost be better if we had a bad sort of recession or depression than nothing, because every time, that might teach the government to be emboldened and to actually do this in the future. So I sure hope that there is a consequence, not enough of a consequence to really hurt people, but enough that the government, learns that this is not the way to do things. So I wrote the afterword of the book, a week after I wrote the foreword, in a very eventful week, which is a little bit over a week ago. And the words are as true now as they were right then. And I'll tell you what I wrote. Disease is complex and difficult. Researchers have worked this realm for 100 years and more, even since the ancient world. If there are solutions to be had, society, and not the state, has the greatest hope of finding them. Instead, we stand before wreckage, imposed in no small part by the use of monolithic force. Healing is an extension of human volition, specialization, and knowledge. Disease and despair are spread by stupidity, pride, and force. Will we learn? Let's look carefully, understand and learn, and then teach. And along with the lessons we pass along, the following lesson, which is never again. So that's the end of my talk. That covers coronavirus and economic virus. Somebody asked me early on if there was a Kindle version. Not yet, but there will be.
Yeah, we'll be waiting for that.
Okay, great.
Peter, thanks for your talks. Has been really enriching right now. I have a few questions.
Sure.
I want to begin with one question.
Yep.
You talk about the conceptual difference within depression and
recession.
Recession, yeah.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit more about that and tell us in your opinion, where are we heading? We're heading to a recession or a depression? One more question. What do you think of the injection of money of the Fed in printing money to solve this problem? I know you have a big opinion on that. So there are our first two questions.
So what's interesting is that in the United States, there's a government body called the National NBER. It's the National. It's the NBER. For the life of me, I can't remember what it stands for now, but they actually have the job of dating the beginning and ending of recessions. And they have never once dated a depression. They don't have a definition of one. So it turns out I did a little research back to the 1930s, and there's two definitions of a depression, right? So a depression is a drop. There's two. One is a drop in GDP of 10% or more. Another is a recession, which is it's 2 quarters of declining GDP. So that's a recession. A depression, the other definition is a recession that goes on for 2 years. So my view is that a drop in GDP of 10% is extremely likely. I've seen estimates for much more than that. A recession that goes on 2 years, that seems very unlikely to me. I mean, I hope so. Oh yes, National Bureau of Economic Research. Thank you, Guillermo. That's right. And then what was the other question was about the Fed's policy? Oops.
What do you think about Trump's policies, because he's talking about like injecting more money to the economy.
Yeah.
The only way to do that in the U.S. is just like printing the money and getting the deficit like huge.
So what they'll do is, what the government will do is, or the Treasury will print out bonds and the Fed will buy them, and that's how they get money into the system. But I mean, so first of all, from the I mentioned earlier that the strategy seems weird because typically, so what we've got going on right now is basically we've got a demand shock, right? So there's the money level staying the same. It's just that goods aren't being produced or whatever. And typically that would not be something that the Fed would do like an expansionary policy on, but they're doing that anyway. So as I said, either they completely misdiagnose the problem, which I kind of doubt. They think that we're in for a credit crunch, which I don't see the beginnings of, but I'll tell you what I have seen. Or they're choosing a very strange policy implementation, as I said, because they want to provide liquidity to the markets, but on that same sort of token, they also want to keep interest rates low and sort of liquidate and provide liquidity for the Treasury's debt, because we're running. I mean, if you think about it, so the U.S. is like 22 trillion in debt. There's something like 150 trillion in unfunded liabilities, which, by the way, if that ever gets triggered, there's no way we're printing 120 trillion. Maybe a few trillion will come out, and then all the rest will have to go, because those are basically things that the government has promised to backstop. But they couldn't backstop all of it; it'd be impossible. But we also now have the Fed said they were going to do a $4 trillion essentially liquidity event, and now they basically said it's open-ended. We've got a $2 trillion stimulus, and already yesterday, Nancy Pelosi has said we should just print that. We should do another $1 trillion stimulus. So here's the thing. There's no papering over what's happening. And all this is going to do is create more distortions down the line. It's going to create more mispricings. Anybody who doesn't live in the United States should be pissed off about it, because because Fed policies export a lot of inflation to other places. So I mean, I don't see, the only thing I see maybe constructive from what the Fed is, I think when they had that, maybe it was the 20th or maybe it was the 12th. It was a Sunday afternoon, which is very rare for the Fed. They made an announcement that they were going to take interest rates down to zero and provide a certain amount of liquidity. I think that they did that sort of for shock value, and also to sort of express confidence to the markets that there's going to be liquidity for these types of things, these instruments and these transactions, all that. I can see doing that, but to actually do it and then bring all this money in there, I mean, we still have a market that's very up and down. It's on a hair trigger, and all we've done essentially is taught many market participants that if you're big enough, or if you're important enough, or if you're high enough on someone's speed dial, you're going to get help if there's trouble. And there's a tremendous amount of moral hazard in that. In addition to, as I said, a lot of distortion, a lot of there's going to be price effects. The capital structure is going to be influenced, all that. So it's not how to fix this. Ironically, the way to fix this situation is to embrace more freedom, and to introduce more sort of let prices fluctuate, and maybe remove the regulatory barriers and all that sort of thing. But that's never the way that it seems to go.
Great answer. Thank you. Guido Chiriboga, he's the dean of the political science at the Universidad Casa Grande, has a really interesting question. He says, in developing countries, the majority of the people have little or no savings. How can they survive economically and health-wise with social distancing and shutdowns? That applies to Ecuador.
Yep. No, it's a terrible policy. It's a terrible policy for anyone. Like I said, I mean, I think if you let, I don't really have a problem with a sort of regulatory agency that alerts people, say to new pandemics or new diseases and all that stuff. That could be one function of that's kind of a harmless government policy, perhaps, to act almost like medical intelligence or something like that. But these policies are destructive. And the thing is that, especially in the developing world, people without savings, people without a really secure supply chain, all that sort of thing. I mean, many of those jobs. I mean, it's going to happen in the U.S. too, but to a lot lesser extent, I think. Many of those jobs, when they disappear, they don't come back. It's not like here where somebody will say, "Oh, I have to close down, but I'll see you in 2 weeks or whatever." I mean, so I mean, again, I mean, that's one of the things I think is important about the Federal Reserve is so long as the the U.S. and China are the biggest traders in the world, and the Federal Reserve is basically in charge of the reserve currency of the world. These policies go beyond simple Americans; they affect everyone. And I think it's important. I think it's important for American economists like myself to indicate that we understand that, and we don't support that either.
Yeah, I think there's many people who agree with you here. Yeah. Guillermo Avellán, he's a director of research at the Ecuador Libre.
Mm-hmm.
How this crisis will affect to oil prices in the following months? Ecuador is currently receiving zero oil income from its exports. What do you think will happen with that?
So there's a separate story there, and it started out with Russia and Saudi Arabia basically agreeing to up their production. So oil prices fell to, I think, 30-year lows recently. They fell below $20. But one of the, I mean, that to me would be one of the positives about this, because at least people are not spending a lot on oil. They're not driving anyway, but to spend less on oil means more discretionary consumption. But recently, Trump has, I guess, been talking to, I don't know which one of the two parties, I would guess Saudi Arabia, about raising their production back up. And he's not doing it to be a nice guy. He's doing it to protect the American shale oil producers and all those. So, I mean, I would expect oil prices to rise a few bucks in the next couple of months, maybe $20, $25 for West Texas International, but not that much.
Jose Merino, who is a researcher at the Ecuador Libre, has an interesting question. He says,
"Sure.
It is yet said that a vaccine is far away from our present reality, perhaps a year and a half from now. How likely do you think this will become, besides an economic crisis, into a financial crisis and a debt crisis?"
I think in the financial markets, we had a liquidity crisis that's been solved. I don't think there's going to be a credit crisis. As for a fiscal crisis, it's hard to say. From the perspective of the United States, we've recently seen problems in a very, very strange and unfollowed part of the financial markets called the repo market. And so for a long time, it was just assumed that the U.S. could basically sell as much debt as it could, and there would always be an appetite for it. There would always be other countries that were willing to buy U.S. debt. But now with the entire yield curve out to 30-year bonds, I think it's the 30-year bond is the only one that's over 1%. The 10-year and on down is all under 1%. That's very, very low yield. I'm not sure. And we've had some suggestions and things that have been happening in the short-term bond market and in the repo market that maybe there isn't this appetite.